Very good.
All right, thank you. So good morning, everybody. We are going to talk about online instruction. And I kind of look at it from the viewpoint of, we're going to say positives and negatives here, but it's really not positives and negatives. It's a continuum. And when we think about it, we're going to actually have to think about where each particular aspect falls on that continuum, because it is here and into the future. So I'm going to get rid of all the nice little people and put you all down here for now.
If you go to more, you can actually get rid of both things. You go to more right over there. You can go to hide video panel.
Okay, now you're all getting hid. So
and hide floating meeting controls. You want to get rid of that too.
All right. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So I am Christine Royce. I am in teacher ed. If you have not yet heard me talk, I am a proponent for having online instruction and learning with the right aspects. It's not for everyone. It's also not for every student. It's not for every faculty. So we have to figure out where different people fall into the process. All right. So we're going to look at some of the positive aspects. We're going to look at a few of the negative aspects. I kind of say challenges rather than negative. I once heard that when you put a plus and a minus, you should change the minus to a delta, because it's not good just to focus on what didn't work, but how are we going to change it? And then also some lessons learned. So I think the most interesting thing that's come out of this pandemic is everybody decided they're going to hate online instruction. But the shifting of online on a March day in 2020 is not really online instruction. So it's been actually dubbed emergency remote teaching, or abbreviated ERT. And this has actually now made its way into the literature as a temporary shift of instructional delivery to an alternative delivery mode due to a crisis circumstance. And that's the problem. What we did was shift because of a crisis, not plan to actually go online. And emergency remote teaching is not supposed to actually replace what we were doing in the classroom. It was supposed to just be this Band-Aid. So two views on this. One is blended. All right. So blended is when we have any kind of aspect of traditional face-to-face and online. This may be more appealing than solely online for some people. And I'm going to put the caveat on here. High flex, where kids choose when they show up where and what they do, is not blended. So again, some language differences. But from the research, and I have a note at the end, I'm happy to send anybody the list of references I have for these. Blended instruction has been shown to have positive impacts on student success if the purpose is clearly established and the developmental level of the learners is considered. We can't just lecture or go in and talk and expect them to actually know what they're supposed to walk away with. Blended is becoming, it's been around for a good 15, 20 years, but it's becoming a greater paradigm in science education. And that's kind of my background. So not labs. Labs you can't do online. Labs you have to do face-to-face. But flipping the classroom in terms of blended and flipped learning, where the students watch something ahead of time and then come in and apply the knowledge, has been shown to actually start to improve science education and topics. There's some recent studies out that talk about videos of the demonstrations improving and being better than just the in-class demonstration. But this does require thoughtful and carefully planned instructional sequences. We have to have clear objectives. The students have to know what they are. We have to have that clear pedagogical approach as we go through. Online is more of that, everything is online, and it could be synchronous or asynchronous. But we actually have to start to think about, what is the structure? Is there a point when it's asynchronous? And is there a point when we should have synchronous online? So the structure has to be for the kids' benefit as well. By kids, I mean any learner, all right? Unstructured has clearly been shown to not be effective. And when we think about not having structure, I think we've all been in a class, a meeting, some kind of Zoom meeting, whatever we've been in, where there's no structure and you're kind of like, I don't know what the point of this is. So giving that heads up to the students, outlining it. The delivery method alone in some of the research, and this goes back several years to the Department of Education actually, says it's not just the delivery method that's successful. It also has to tie in something else, like the approach, the planning, the outline, et cetera. And for online, we need to transition from substituting content. I'm going to use this here to transforming that instructional process. So this is an interesting graph that came out from a study done by a bunch of different people. Cengage was one of them, UPSEA, which is University Professional and Continuing Education Association. And this was asked, and regardless of what the results show, they called this teaching techniques. These are not teaching techniques. We don't teach by distributing information. We don't teach by simply having some kind of chat. These are all methods to deliver content. And we have to start to really think about, is it the tool for delivery versus the strategy for teaching as we go through? Sorry. So one of the pieces of literature that came out, and this is kind of an interesting one, said online instruction during the pandemic was, in quotes, the world's biggest educational technology or ed tech experiment in history. And if you think about that, it's true. We perhaps did not set it up as well as we could have, but it was really going to be the only time everything was going to have to change. So this experiment, as expected with any experiment, has some findings. So findings from one of the studies, and the study is actually student and faculty experiences with emergency remote learning, and this was done spring of 2020 from Ithaca SR. They just abbreviate everything. But the findings that came out, and these are coming out from all other studies as well. Preparation. Faculty who had prior experience doing online adapted better. Okay, the statement of no, really? Yeah, that makes sense. So we have to make sure that we continue to prepare. Communication. There needs to be a greater level of communication. As we're doing anything, we have to be clearer and more specific with what information we're sharing. The teaching part, continue to teach the class, albeit in a modified approach, rather than simply post content. That goes back to that whole teaching aspect. We can't just post stuff and think kids are going to get it. We have to actually perhaps do synchronous online learning as we're going through. Student strategies. One of the studies, the study came out and said, students complained about when things were restricted for them. And I know the idea of testing was one of those hot topics that still ends up needing to be resolved if we do ever have online. But faculty would do things like they couldn't go back, they couldn't look at questions, and students were saying that that created difficulty for them as they actually went through and tried to take a test. Organization, faculty need to be more organized in their course online and through the delivery method. And instructional strategies. We have to use a variety of digital tools, not just lecture as we go through. So I'm going to give you some givens here. I know these are all things we have to deal with and we should have. We have to have institutional support. If there's any kind of online, we have to have the institutional support to include the technology, the professional learning that allows people to become successful at knowing the difference of with the new strategies. We have to have access, and that's for both students and faculty, and that access has to be a given. How we get them that access needs to be figured out. I know we were handing out technology a lot during the pandemic. That's not a long-term solution, but that it's going to be something that if we do future online, how do they get access to students? And commitment and motivation. So both students and faculty need to have that commitment to this and motivation. I mentioned in the narrative that David put out that I took my first online class in '99. Yes, that was during dial-up. It was my choice. I wanted to take it. So there is a difference between forced and choice as we look at this. So as we go through and look at some lessons learned, there's three real broad areas that come out. Professional development, the reflection and identification of lessons and content, what worked, what didn't, and then the connecting and the adapting part as we think about it. So for professional learning, we have to have people adjust their pedagogy as they're looking at it for more opportunity for student interaction in smaller chunks of information. A 45-minute or a 50-minute or a 75-minute lecture doesn't work. So doing something for 15 or 20 minutes and then having the students interact is the way, we have to start to look at those things. Faculty end up needing preparation and ongoing professional learning around the model. It's called TPAC, which is technological, pedagogical, content knowledge. So we know there's stuff we know, how we teach the stuff we know. But the fourth aspect of that is, how do we teach the stuff we know with technology? As well as just the learning management system. That was one of those where not everybody was using it, and that just right there required some time. So the thoughtful reflection part, these are questions for faculty to think about, because I'm presenting to faculty. If students, you would say, why are you taking an online class? But why are you teaching online? The pandemic, some will say, because I was forced to. Well, then you might not ever want to do that again. So you're going to have to make some decisions. And the good thing is here, we can't be forced to teach online, perhaps outside of a crisis, okay? What have you done differently to differentiate your content? And how did you approach that? And how will you end up incorporating new strategies? The connecting part, we need to adjust our pedagogy, as I mentioned before, for student interaction, but we also have to focus on transitioning and modifying instruction to be more student-driven in an online format. So this is one model that is actually a recommended model. It's called the Pickwrap model, and it doesn't stand for, the model is just Pickwrap, but you can see on the side it's PIC is passive, interactive, and creative. And the teacher's use of technology it replaces, it amplifies, or it transforms. So as we think about things, we don't just want to simply put up a PowerPoint of what we might have talked about, because all we're doing is replacing a lecture with a PowerPoint, but students are going to still be very passive. So we might want to end up having, I know their biology group, that with some of the things they were using Kahoot, that makes it a little bit more interactive. Shut the music off if you don't know anything about Kahoot, because otherwise it will drive you nuts. At least it does for me. But we want to start to move things more towards the right and more towards the top. So the upper right quadrant is where we're shooting for. And as we think about this, it's a challenge to do, because, well, people will say interactive, well, I'm asking them questions, but that's still largely passive if we really think about it. Trying to go through, having the students engage, have the students do, but this model is starting to actually gain a lot of use, specifically after the launch of the pandemic, I will say. The whole part is we can't just replace what we're doing with a piece of technology. So this is actually quite old. It's probably a good 8-10 years old already, I think. But this is it. Like, it's just not, I take this and do the same thing with a tool that's digital. We have to actually change how we're doing it and figure out what our purpose is, and then identify the tool that we're going to use to accomplish that new purpose. So as I'm walking around campus last week, I came across this sign. It's everywhere if you haven't seen it. And when you look at it, it's Zoom Doom or vaccination. And I am all for people getting vaccinated. That's a given. But we shouldn't necessarily just assume it's Zoom Doom. I think that's going to be some people's experience, but not other people's experience. So we can't just always post something like this about being negative, even though this is a well-meaning poster, all right? So the key reminder is emergency remote teaching should not be conflated with online teaching and learning more broadly. That was one experience. Hopefully we don't repeat it. However, online is a different experience if it's done right and planned for. Another cartoon I saw, I broke this apart, year zero, 1994. We've just invented online learning. 2012, we've just invented online learning because people were still going, I don't know how to do this. 2019, we've reinvented online learning. We shouldn't be here in another year or 2 years or 5 years. We should recognize that online is a modality and is an option. And if you're going to use it, even for blended, you should be like keeping up with what's happening with the technology. As we kind of end with some of this, I think as we look towards the future, there are going to be preferences. Students there's some research already out that students are saying they like a mix of classes. And by mix, it might be one of the day's classes is face-to-face and one of the day's classes is blended asynchronous where they're applying something. So there's going to be a mix of those things, I think, that happens. And Shippensburg does have guidelines for blended. The positioning of what we do for online, what higher ed in general does for online, but what we specifically do, I think options for blended or online classes are going to grow, and I think it will start to influence where students attend. Some may go to an institution that only does face-to-face, and some may go to an institution that does a mix, and some might just do total online. Again, we all have a preference, and I think the students are going to have as well, because the kids are coming up more from using technology in K-12. And then I think as we looked at the options, we have to be careful. We have to have a discussion around them to make clear decisions. It is choices for everybody involved, and even those who choose to do online, what that looks like if they do online. So a couple of recommendations, as I went through and talked about some of this and had been doing some research over the last 18 months, largely looking into the literature. This list of recommendations is what I've put together from that. And we have to embrace blended learning. I'm not saying you have to embrace online, but blended at least. You have to prepare for blended learning, both you and the students, which gets down to prep the learners. If you're going to use a digital tool, don't wait till they're online to start to teach them that. We have to identify instructional outcomes because the outcomes or the objectives drive the instruction and the technology supports the instruction. Then we have to select the digital tools and we have to pursue digital wisdom. And that kind of goes back to what Prensky called digital natives versus digital immigrants. He does have another word out called digital wisdom. Just because someone's a digital native does not mean they have digital wisdom of how to actually use it. And just because somebody's a digital immigrant doesn't mean they don't have digital wisdom. It just depends on how they've actually started to apply this over time. So I'm going to say thanks. I was given about 20 minutes. If there's questions, I'm happy to take them. And if you're looking for a list of references around this, just email me and I'm happy to send you the list of references I have. So. All right, I'm going to stop that, get out of here, get my nice little people back so I can see them. All right. Do we have questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
I do have a question, Chris. What would you tell some of our colleagues that still say that they don't like online instruction because it allows students to cheat more, it forces faculty members to watch down curriculum, and that's why face-to-face should be the way to go? So
I think the cheating thing comes from the tests, specifically, like a proctored assessment. That has to be solved. I can't tell them anything beyond that is a definite thing that needs resolution long-term, okay? I don't think content has to be watered down. I think it does need to go a little slower if students aren't familiar with the tools, the technology, the strategy. So it starts off slower, but then it could pick up. But if students end up using some of these tools in blended instruction or other classes, they're familiar with it. We often have to slow down originally because it's the technology for all involved. So if we're teaching kids to use that a little bit more, we still might have a little bit of a like ramp up, but they're going to become better and better at that all the time. I think, again, if we're just trying to substitute an online lecture for a face-to-face lecture, that's where we have to really step back and reconsider what's a better way to actually have them involved in that content. This may not be a popular statement, but I heard a lot of people say, oh, they shut their cameras off. I couldn't see their face, so I don't know they were engaged. And yes, having cameras off and talking to a black screen is not ideal. But I think there's no guarantee that when I see their face in the classroom, they're mentally engaged either. They're just physically present. So I think there's those kinds of hard discussions we have to think about of how do we switch that. I think the other side is it's not for everybody. And some colleagues may go, so not for me. And I respect that. I mean, you have to know what works for you individually as an educator. And then teach your classes face-to-face, that's great. But that doesn't mean we should prevent students who want to do some kind of mix or faculty from doing that as well. So I think it's finding that common ground, if you will, to recognize where I'm at, but also recognizing what others might need and the students might need. David.
I was really intrigued by the Pickwrap
Yeah.
thing, the schematic there. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sorts of transformations or strategies might fit into that top right
So
square.
if we go back to the Pickwrap chart, and we really start to do, so creative and transformative. So if you're having, I'll start with this. If you normally have a PowerPoint and you're delivering it, that's one thing. But now if we have the kids developing the PowerPoint or developing the outline of content, and we can move up and over, so it's going to kind of amplify it. If we have the students taking the information that they might have learned from watching a flip video and creating their own video associated with that. So now we're at that creative part. And if the faculty member is actually having the students start to look at and critique others' videos, now we're transforming. We're not just substituting that PowerPoint. And this has been a very useful one. We've been doing this with middle school through college across a couple of us have been doing this, where like we designed an interactive demo with microbits, and I won't go into all that, but rather than just talk about how somebody contracts COVID, we've actually used the technology to change how we're doing it to have the students then start to consider. So there's some different things like that as we're going through. Thank you, Andrea. So other questions, I'm happy to answer them now or later. Like, it's not like there's 20 minutes and we're done. This has kind of been like one of my passions, and it's been a good chance to really see what's coming out very current across the world, actually. So please feel free to reach out if you want. So
Thank you very much.
thank you. I'll get it later.
All right. So I'm Dave Monaghan. I'm from the Sociology department. And though I'm a sociologist, I study higher education and education for the most part, empirically, et cetera, and so forth. So that's sort of why I'm contributing to this. I've only kind of dabbled in understanding the impacts of online learning, but I try to do a very intensive literature review for this presentation because I was interested in seeing really what the evidence suggests about this. So this is what I'm gonna do. So, oh, wait a sec. Hold on a second here. I need to share Zoom screen. Let's do this. There we go. I got this snazzy opening screen. All right, so we're talking about quantity and quality. So the purpose of this is to look at, we know that online can increase access to educational environments for people who can't attend traditional settings. But the question is whether or not, and also that it can, in some instances, make the delivery of instruction more economically efficient, that is, it's cheaper. But the question is whether that comes at a cost in terms of quality of instruction, as is measurable in terms of certain outcomes. So I'm going to be looking specifically at experimental and quasi-experimental evidence on how online compares to face-to-face instruction. And I'm going to look only at things happening in higher education. All right, so why online higher education? Why has this been going on? Well, first and foremost, prior to the pandemic, of course, talk about moving more and more of higher education online had been taking place as part of broader discussions about the escalating costs of higher education. As I'm sure most of us are familiar with, the cost of higher education has been rising much faster than household incomes, particularly at the median. It's also been rising faster than state appropriations for higher education. This means that more and more, since states are not funding higher education, higher educational institutions like ours are having to raise tuition. They're having to raise it faster than students' families' incomes are rising. Thusly, higher education is costing families more and more of a chunk of their income as we go year to year to year. And this is ultimately going to be somewhat unsustainable. Right, so the idea, so the solutions to this so far have been, first of all, to shift the burden onto families and students, mostly in terms of increasing student debt, and the progressive defunding of public colleges, right? That's how we've dealt with the fact that higher education has cost more money, is we've just not spent the money, and we required students and families to pick up the tab. So that's, not a very good sustainable answer to this. The question is whether or not online learning gives a possibility for, as economist Dave Deming puts it, bending the cost curve in higher education, right? Does technology offer us ways to deliver similarly high quality education at a lower cost? Can it actually keep education from continuing to escalate more and more and more? Right. And the other piece of this is why we're talking about how online higher education is, as Christine pointed out, the COVID-19 pandemic, which pushed pretty much all higher education online or partially online for over a year. Right. So a lot of people have asked whether this impacted learning. Was this an opportunity to make college cheaper and more accessible? Was it an opportunity to sort of force the industry to make the changes that it was going to need to make eventually? Right. So I'm going to start by talking about, first of all, some descriptive statistics about how common online higher education is and who is online. I'll talk about the theories that have been advanced for why online might improve or worsen outcomes vis-a-vis in-person education. I'll discuss why I'm focusing on experimental and quasi-experimental designs. I'll then go through what the research has said about how online and in-person compare, and I will offer some conclusions based on what these studies have said. All right, so first and foremost, prevalence of online education. So the data we have is from fall 19, and that is before the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the most recent data that's been put out by the Department of Ed. The COVID year pandemic data has not been released yet. So this is what was happening right on the cusp of the pandemic. Right, so overall, so I'm separating it into any online, right? So if you take just some classes versus a fully online program. And of course, fully online programs are part of any online. So about a third of all college students in fall 2019 were taking some online class, and about 15% were fully online. The proportions vary quite a bit among different types of colleges. Some look at community colleges, the public 4 years, that's not for-profit 4 years, for-profit 2 and for-profit 4 year. The numbers here are fairly similar in the public sector as they are to overall. Where it really stands out is over here in the for-profit 4 year sector, where the majority of students are in fact in fully online programs. And 80.5% or 80.5% are in at least taking an online program, but 2/3 are in fully online programs. So the for-profit sector, this is, I'm sure, not really news to anyone. It's really the outlier in terms of this. In graduate education, so that was undergrad, this is graduate education. Graduate students overall are more online than undergrads are. 42% of graduate students were in any online, and about 1/3 were in an online program. That includes about 1/4 of students in public higher educational institutions who are grad students who are in fully online programs. In for-profit institutions, about 86% were in fully online programs. So we see there's a kind of a for-profit effect going on, and there's a graduate student effect. But of course, just because the prevalence varies by sector doesn't mean that's where most online students are. The fact is that the overwhelming majority of students overall are in the public undergraduate sector, and that is also where the overwhelming majority of online students are. So this is distribution of students. Online students is partially online and online program. So both for partially online students, the overwhelming majority are either community college students or four-year public higher education institutions like Shippensburg or Penn State. The for-profit sector, they're right here actually. That's the for-profit 4 years, right there, undergraduates. So even though it's a humongous percentage, they're a fairly small slice of the whole higher education market, and therefore they're a small slice of online students. And these are all the graduate students, right? These 3 colors right up here. For fully online, it's more graduate students and it's more for-profit folks, but still a humongous chunk is in that traditional 4-year traditional community college, public and not-for-profit sector, right? So just because the online students are are disproportionately graduate student and disproportionately for-profit, it doesn't mean that's who the online students are overall, right? When we're talking about online students, we are still mostly talking about undergraduates. We're still mostly talking about people in the public sector. We can look at trends in terms of online. So I'm comparing online in 2003 to 2015. That is unfortunately the most recent longitudinal data that we have. As we can see, so I'm shepherding it out again by any online and by fully online programs. In most sectors, so for community colleges, public 4 years, not-for-profits, what's really expanded is moving some classes online. Is in the public, the for-profit 4 years that online programs have really expanded the most. Online programs have really not expanded that much in the public sector for undergraduates at least. They've expanded more in the not-for-profit sector, the private not-for-profits. That I think is driven by some very big private not-for-profit institutions like the University of Southern New Hampshire, which went from being a fairly small school to being a massive online institution. So that's kind of what's been going on. So online is becoming more prevalent, but really moving some classes, not full programs for undergraduates, except for in the for-profit sector. And then in terms of who takes online, there are some slight gender differences with female students taking higher education online a bit more, both in terms of programs and any. There are a little bit in the way of racial disparities with white and black students taking online at higher rates than Asian and Latino. But the real story is age, which is probably, again, not surprising, right? Older students are more likely to take online classes and online programs. This is often because they have these competing priorities, or they can't move to go to college, right? They have to take college either nearby, or online opens up the possibility for them attending a school to begin with. Maybe they live in an education desert, someplace where there is no higher educational institution, like at the 4-year level, that has classes at night that they can attend. Like, for example, SHIP does very few of those classes, right? So the Cumberland Valley, people really would have to drive very, very far to take bachelor's level classes. So online can really open up the market for those folks. And there's a little bit of a, for full or part-time enrollment, part-time students are more likely to be online as well. So, there's kind of a mixed story with this kind of thing. So in terms of what the theories say about why online might help or hurt, why it might benefit educational outcomes or why it might impact them negatively. So I'll go through what might be beneficial and what might impact negatively in turn. So first of all, I'm going to comparing to fully in-person instruction. So that's important to understand. And we'll talk about the outcomes of being learning, performance, student credit accumulation, and degree attainment. So why might online classes improve outcomes? Well, those who think about it offer a number of ideas. First of all, online classes offer flexibility of timing. In-person classes meet at a particular time of day in a particular location. People whose time is taken up particularly by childcare or career responsibilities can't necessarily make that specific time. A lot of times, particularly asynchronous instruction allows for people to tune in when they can, to watch the lesson when they have some availability. Okay. Secondly, there's a lower cost of attendance in terms of how much effort a person has to make to get to class. In a very simple way, turning on a computer is easier than getting in your car and driving to school. Okay. So for people whose time and energy is constrained, online learning offers the possibility of better outcomes. And finally, online gives the possibility of greater student control. Specific forms of online instruction can give students more control over the pace of instruction. You can pause a lecture. Students can't pause me when I'm talking, right? They can pause an online instructor. They can control the pace of instruction. They can go back in the lecture and have the instructor repeat things 3 or 4 times, right? All of this basically says that online has the possibility of empowering students, kind of as individual learners. Yeah. All right, so online has also been postulated to potentially worsen outcomes. So why might that be? Well, simply because there is greater empowerment of students, it also, thing about privileges is they become obligations at a certain point. So empowering a student also imposes certain obligations upon them. Students are given more power, but they also have to use it. So it relies more on student initiative. So students with better developed non-cognitive skills, time management, initiative, organization, things like this are more likely to excel. And students who struggle with these sorts of skills may do better in in-person format, where things are more structured. There's reduced interaction opportunities for both with faculty and with peers, right? Particularly with asynchronous. Even with synchronous, it's very different in-person interacting over Zoom, right? Human beings are creatures who understand and communicate through multiple avenues. We communicate through tone of voice, through facial expression, through gesture, et cetera, and so forth. Every time you step away from co-presence, you reduce the richness of communication by a certain amount. So that is reduced as well. So to the extent that people get a social benefit from attending class in person, socially with their peers and through the instructor, that's compromised in the online format. And then the interaction with the faculty that does happen, as I said, may be less meaningful and impactful because of that reduced way of interacting. Right? I'm not speaking about improving access. I think that's a different question. This is given access, what are the impacts on outcomes? Right? All right. So the question about why we're going to look at where we're looking at experimental and quasi-experimental has to do with when we can really nail down causality. And this is super important when comparing online with in-person, is when can we really compare the two experiences? And Christine made a really good point, which is comparing the COVID-19 pandemic to the optimal case of online education is inappropriate because the impacts of COVID will be all mixed up with the impacts of moving online, right? So what we want is how do we get an apples to apples comparison, not an apples to oranges comparison. So because people select themselves in a different treatment, so students often or typically choose whether to go online or to go in person. There may be different sorts of students that may select themselves into online instruction versus in-person instruction. If the things that lead students to select online instruction are correlated with outcomes anyway, right? If students with less well-developed non-cognitive skills are also more likely to take online instruction, then naive estimates, just comparing online students to in-person students, is a biased estimation, right? So that's an improper estimation. So the way that social scientists these days look at things is through the potential, the counterfactual or potential outcomes framework. The ideal is that we see a given subject, let's say Jose, we see him both taking an online class, and at the same time, the same Jose takes the class in person. We run 2 versions of Jose over time, and we look at the outcomes, right? Then we'd be able to tell the counterfactual, right? Unfortunately, of course, and that would give us the individual level causal effect. The tricky thing with this is, of course, that can never happen. People either do the one thing or do the other. You never see they never see the counterfactual, and this is what people refer to as the fundamental problem of causal inference. However, we can find reasonable counterfactuals, right? These would be subjects who are similar in all ways except for the treatment experience itself. This is impossible to do for individuals. However, you can do it for groups. And the way you can do it is through random assignment, right? If you have a random assignment experiment, then that will effectively break the link between the treatment variable and possible confounders by the fact that nothing is causing a person to take online versus in person except for the coin flip itself. It should produce groups that vary on average only in terms of their exposure to the treatment, not in terms of anything else. And therefore, if that goes on, then we can attribute any difference in outcomes to the treatment itself. Yeah. This is why randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard for causal inference. There's excellent internal validity. That is, we know pretty well we are identifying the real impact of X on Y. The issue is, of course, just because you have excellent internal validity, you don't have excellent external validity. So usually with experiments, we take whoever we can get and we randomize, which means your sample is a convenient sample, so you can only externalize and generalize with caution. Okay, so that's a tricky thing about that. The next best is a quasi-experiment, right? So most folks who do this do what is called an instrumental variable design. This is you find some variable, which we'll call the instrument, that effectively randomizes exposure to treatment, right? So you get some sort of instrumental variable C, which causes exposure, but it is uncorrelated with the confounders, and it only impacts the exposure through the outcome, right? So it does impact exposure to the treatment, not correlated with confounders, and has no impact on the outcome except through the treatment itself. So a good example is Jeffrey Angrist's study of the impact of veteran status on lifetime earnings. He was able to do so by using draft lottery number, because then people were actually sort of randomly assigned to the military, right? So that's an instrumental variable for military service. Some people, of course, went into the military voluntarily. Those people are factored out. Okay, and then finally, the next best is if we can do really, really good statistical control, right? So if we have rich covariate controls, this is good, but we might have unmeasured confounders, particularly traits of students, faculty, courses, and colleges that are more likely to be online or in person. So if you have multiple observations per professor or per student or per college, then you can use a fixed effects model in which you enter a dummy for each individual unit, like each individual student, each individual faculty member, et cetera, and so forth. This controls for unmeasured but fixed characteristics of that unit. That should say fixed effects. So studies with multiple fixed effects that enter student, instructor, subject, and college fixed effects are most credible. They do a decent job of controlling. It's not as good as quasi-experiment, not as good as experiment. It does, however, require a very large data set. So you need to have tens of thousands of observations typically. All right. Now, before I go into my analysis of the data, there was a meta-analysis of online that was done by the DOE in 2009. And they found, they looked at all online versus in-person experiments and quasi-experiments for about a decade. 46 studies, 51 treatment effects. And they found that on average, online outperformed face-to-face by 0.24 standard deviations. However, Jaggers and Bailey from the Community College Research Center reviewed the study and found that only 7 of the studies they reviewed were fully online and semester long, and none of these studies showed any significant effect at all. So all of these were taken from very short, like session-long interventions, right? And the issue is it, as Bailey puts it, as Jaggers and Bailey put it, demonstrates that students can learn information on a specific topic from a computer just as readily as they can from a human, but cannot address challenging issues of maintaining attention, learning, motivation, and persistence over several months. All right, so I'm gonna look at only the kinds of studies I already talked about, That is experimental designs, and I found 14 of those. Instrumental variable designs, 7 of those, and multiple fixed effects design, there's 3 of those. Comparisons, I'll look at fully online versus fully in person, and blended or flipped classroom versus fully in person. So we've got 15 of the former and 9 of the latter. Some of these studies did both, so that's why it doesn't add up. I'm looking only at where full courses were evaluated. I'm going to speak to matters of generalizability. So how big is the study and what student population is it drawing from? And then I'll look at studies that study heterogeneity, so different effects by different kinds of students. And 10 of studies looked at those. Okay, so first, fully online versus fully in person. All right, now this is all the studies that do this. There's a lot of different stuff. There are some positive findings. So this Chirikov et al. Found positive scores on midterm exams. A null finding for the final, negative for student satisfaction. All right, the Porter and Feldman found positive impacts on exams and satisfaction. But that's it for positive, and there's a couple of null findings. So Figlio et al. Found null findings, and so did Harrington et al. Everything else found negative impacts of fully online versus in person. And another thing that's important to point out is the positive and null findings are isolated to selective colleges, right? With this exception right here, right? But most of them are fairly small studies in selected public colleges, right? The studies that looked at the typical online student, that is a student who is in a public, like in a for-profit or in a less selective public four-year or a community college, uniformly find not only negative effects, but very, very large negative effects. Right, so, and often these negative effects, like in Bettinger et al., persist past the actual class itself to be seen in future classes, right? And even in retention and degree completion later on. So blended versus in-person, there's fewer studies that look at this, and the impacts are more mixed. There are some positive impacts on completion, and I'm including flipped classrooms in blended instruction here. So. They're positive on exams and post-tests and finals for a few of them. For the only 2 studies that use community colleges that don't involve selective public institutions, there are negative impacts, but there are smaller negative impacts than for fully online. And then in terms of heterogeneity, so how does this affect different students differently? There are 2 studies that didn't find any heterogeneous effects. All of the rest of them found heterogeneous effects in the same exact directions. That is, online classes had worse outcomes for minority students, for less prepared students, for male students, and for younger students, right? So the students who are more in need of educational intervention suffered more under online instruction than the students who are better prepared, right? So I think that's very important to consider when we were thinking about moving more of Shippensburg online, for example. Most of our students, some of them are the kind of students who can thrive online, but a lot of them are the kind of students who have been found to really, really struggle. And I think for a lot of us, we saw some of this last year. So the takeaways. First, for fully online, the majority of studies showed negative effects on central academic measures. Positive and null findings were confined to smaller studies at selected institutions, and negative impacts were often large and extend to future course performance, retention, and degree attainment. For blended, there are fewer studies and more mixed results, right? We have some more positive and null findings, but they are also confined to selective institutions. And there are only negative impacts in large studies and with non-elite students, although the negative impacts are typically smaller than for fully online. For heterogeneity, we show exacerbation of achievement gaps through online learning. Although some better prepared students appear to thrive in online and blended. Less prepared students typically do much worse relative to in-person. And this is from Bettinger et al. Study of DeVry University, very large for-profit. This is the positive impact of taking a class in person instead of online relative to one's decile of former GPA. So as you can see, as you get lower down in the prior GPA distribution, the impacts of taking an in-person class are larger and larger, i.e. the impact of taking an online course is negative and larger, right? So online is sort of kind of where we're going to some extent. It does expand access, it can be flexible, and it can be economical. However, the research suggests that for non-elite students, fully online environments lower completion and grades, negatively impact future course performance, retention, degree attainment, and expand achievement gaps at race, gender, and prior academic performance. Right, so there are more mixed and moderate impacts for blended. And online and blended, I think we can cautiously say, could be a good solution for well-prepared and intrinsically motivated students. For example, in graduate programs, a lot of graduate students who already got a bachelor's degree and show they can sort of hack higher education seem to do just as well in online environments. For students who are first-time freshmen who struggled in high school, online just does not seem to be what the research is suggesting is a good idea, at least at this point. And of course, this is a very kind of blunt edge tool that I'm using here, where it's all online versus all instruction. And I think Christine's point that there are different ways you can do online that can have different outcomes is also very, very important to consider. All right. All right, I can take maybe one question. Sorry for going a bit over there. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you know in the studies that you reviewed for this presentation, do you know if the researchers took into consideration, just to name an example, if the instructors had quality matters?
Oh, that was not, no, absolutely. I never saw that mentioned. Now, people may have had other sorts of training. They may have had prior experience. That is hard to tell. Including instructor fixed effects helps to a certain extent because then you control for instructor effects, yeah. Right? But still, if no one has the training, then it would
be interesting to see a study that took into consideration that variable and also this type of technology that was available. Because I mean, a study done in 2009 compared to one done now in terms of technology. Right. Probably we're going to see significant difference.
It's true, though most of the studies I reviewed are from the last few years. Now, they may have used data from before that, but of course, research is it's a slow science, right?
It's true. And it's hard to keep up, especially
it's hard to keep up. Right, that's why the COVID-19 stuff, we don't have most of it right now. It's just not, it's not there. So
but,
yeah.
It's interesting. I'm sorry if this is to me is really, really interesting because we can say, and for people that hate online instruction, say, you see, students are going to perform poorly. I mean, underprepared students are going to perform poorly if they do online education, but the same could be said about face-to-face if the students are not given the tools. Because, motivated student, an independent student, a field-dependent student is going to do well regardless.
Yes,
but
exactly.
Students that, especially the ones that we're attracting more and more over the past few years, are students that regardless of the modality, if we don't give them the tools that they need to succeed in class, they're going to fail anyway.
Right. No, I think that's true. What I will say though is that so the big studies are drawing from student bodies very similar to ours and comparing, usually through quasi-experimental or multiple fixed effects, online versus in person. And they find that for those kinds of students, the impacts are even, like the performance is substantially worse when it's particularly fully online is done, right? And my suspicion is that some of the benefits of in-person education cannot be replicated in an online environment because they are the benefits of physical co-presence with another human. That human beings, by our very nature, are cued to respond to. And that being outside of that, being on a computer, being on your own, is maybe not the best way for some students to learn, unless they are, as we said, very well prepared and very motivated, and they really want to get that graduate degree so they can get their promotion at work, right? Those students are going to do it. Our students, we know that coming to class is really important, right? Coming to class online is harder to enforce and it happens less. and they do it less and they pay less attention while they're there. And there is some degree of responsibility that's maintained just by eye contact. That's lacking in online, right? So I wonder about the extent to which technology can fully replicate in-person communication, and that I think we assume people are these sort of isolated individuals who you can put in environments, and as long as you tweak the technology, they'll respond. And I don't know that that's the case. That's my own. I'm going way into editorializing though, as far as that goes. The research doesn't say all of that stuff. Yeah.
But I think that's part of the point of that technology integration model. Putting them online, we can't just replicate what's happening. So, and I know studies don't get, I suspect those studies probably don't get into, did they change their instructional structure? Right. So I think that's the question, the big question.
Right. And I think there needs to be more rigorous research testing specific ways of running different online classes as well. So comparing an online class with this modality versus an online class with that modality. Maybe compared to in person, who knows? But just compare to each other. The point is right now, in terms of really rigorous research, we have a lot, but it's very blunt, right? So we need more rigorous testing of things that work and don't work. And we should do that.
Are you part of the distance set committee?
Nope.
But you are.
I am.
So, because it would be interesting for that committee to have access to what you research, because
sure.
The one thing that I hope it happens when it goes through the UCC process is that if someone is trying to turn a course that is already established from face-to-face to online, the course proposal also requires the faculty member to provide what sort of, I don't want to be too educational here, but differentiation, what sort of tools they're going to use, you see what I'm talking about? To make sure that anyone taking that class that was face-to-face now and now is going to be online has the same level of success, as opposed to just take, as Christine was saying, putting PowerPoints online and everything online instead of face-to-face, and voila, this is online when there is not real online teaching.
Right. We should also look at the data after this happens and see whether it works. Right. See whether the accountability is really there. And higher education, we don't really do a really good job of crunching our own data and looking at whether our practices work or don't. We sort of solve an issue and we're like, done. Yeah. I have to actually get to a class right now, but thank you everyone for coming. And this will be posted to Zoom.
Interesting.